Hey. Welcome back to Current Faces and New Ventures with Dhati and Daniel. We're excited to keep hosting this conversation around minority-led networks and the importance of them. And so really, a lot of the things that Dhati and I are going to be talking about and have been talking about, you listened to our first episode already, you know that we're having conversations that really typically in a tone and a fashion that we would have kind of after an event, after a conference, after a meeting. We're having really what we think are the conversations behind the conversations. And this is where we think it's important to have the conversations behind the conversations become the main conversations. And so to really leave things all out on the table. And that's really what we're hoping to do when we jump into future episodes on Current Faces and New Ventures.
Yeah. Daniel, I guess one of my questions is, I don't know, is the world ready for conversations behind the conversations? Are they ready for that? Like, I don't know. This is some intimate stuff going on here. We're talking.
It is, man. But like, I mean, how many times have you and I been asked, "Hey, can you help us figure this out? Can you help us to finesse this? Can you help us?" And it really is. Whenever that happens, like I have a sense in which they're saying, "Hey, we want to keep the conversation over here, and so can you help us keep the conversation over here?" And I don't know if the world's ready to have, especially our small world of American church planting. But I think it's important to have us advance the conversation and to streamline the conversation. So I don't know.
I'm 100% with you. And, one of the things, and I think that's the reason why we want to have this time, right? We want to explain why it's important for us to spotlight specifically minority-led networks. And because that's where we have the conversations behind the conversations. That's where we have is like, okay, I can breathe. This is like, I can talk. I can be real. I don't got to be on. I don't have to code switch. I don't have to do any of that stuff. I can just talk and let's just keep it real, right? And so this is the reason why, like now and in future episodes, we're going to be interviewing just other leaders who are leading networks like this, right? So we can take a deep dive to better understand kind of what both we're doing, what they're doing, right? So we can get the really real, you know what I'm saying? And so I think that is why this is important. What we're doing is important. I'm thankful for Exponential being able to host this because that's what people want. They want to know the conversation behind the conversation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And it's going to be imperfect. Like the subject that we're going to talk about today. I mean, we're going to talk about it imperfectly, but at the same time, we got to make sure that we're not just getting stuck in the nuance, because sometimes you can get stuck in the nuance. Like I'm always constantly trying to explain myself and that's important, but we want to get to actual real change in order to be more effective in seeing the kingdom of God come. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah. All right. But before we jump into all that, we're going to get into some of the heavy stuff later. This is the Christmas season. 'Tis the season to be jolly, right? And so I want to know from you, Daniel, right? Just kind of as among family, how has it been for you growing up? Like this Christmas season brings you kind of the warm and fuzzies, the bubblies. Like what does it do for you, right? And especially as an immigrant among family.
Yeah. So growing up, like I grew up in the projects. So I was born in Illinois, but grew up in Detroit. But even my time in Illinois, it was like maybe 8 years, we lived in the projects. And so Santa Claus, he always came through the front door with like really good looking white people. So to me, like growing up, that was and I mean, we loved it because it was a Lutheran church. They loved our family. And my parents became followers of Jesus because of that Lutheran church. So, but to me, that set the tone for what Christmas was. It was a big man in a red suit with the gift bags and, really awesome, clean looking, youth group white kids. And that really had a early on impact on, how we just like thought about the season and we celebrated Christmas. And to a certain degree, like, it was like, I don't want to racialize like that experience, but like that to me was a big part of my upbringing, like learning the American celebration of the Christmas holiday. Because prior to that, my parents were never, they weren't Christians. Like my dad was 40 when he became a Christian. He had lived a whole entire life, not following Jesus, and then immigrated to America as a refugee immigrant when he was 39. When he was 39, became a Christian at 41, and so we learned Christmas, like commercial Christmas, not through the Bible, but through kind of like church outreach, and then through like the commercial version of Christmas. And even when we moved into Detroit, and then I kind of essentially grew up inner city Detroit, and so much of Christmas was like, it was poor Christmas, man. I don't know if you can relate to that, Dad. I mean, your dad was an NFL player, so I don't know if you had poor Christmas. What about you though? Like for me though, Christmas for me, like it was opening up underwear and toothbrushes.
Yeah.
That was Christmas for me.
No, I mean, definitely I've had different experiences in Christmas, but I do want to just address something that you said. One of the things that you said, you don't want to racialize it. And this, this podcast is not about racializing anything and doing all that. But one of the things, and the reason why I was asking you earlier about this as a Hmong family, right? I think it's really important for us to recognize the importance, especially is kind of, talk about because it's important for us to identify both who we are, where we're coming from, and it's kind of like talking about our unique perspective. I like to talk oftentimes. It's like going overseas and never mentioning you're American, or it's kind of like, because that is just a part of it. Like when you're over there, it's constantly referred to that you're American, or because you're the minority. And when you're in the minority, you constantly have to define and redefine and all those things. And I think that's why it's really important for us not to shy away. We're not here to bash any cultural group or ethnic group or anything, but it is about, for us as minorities, again, we're talking about minority networks, right? And minority network leaders. And so this is the kind of the way we talk. We have to be able to identify the perspectives that we're coming from, the angles that we're coming from, the experiences that we have, because we recognize that there's a danger in a single story that we just automatically assume that there's kind of one kind of upbringing. And, and like you said, for me, there was a time where I used to go Christmas. What do you want for Christmas? It was like, get whatever you want. But the story that many times people don't know about me growing up, because my dad played football, as soon as he was done with football, we were on welfare, right? Because we went from one extreme to the other extreme, and we went there very quickly. And so I remember the toothbrushes and the bare necessities type of Christmas, I never went for wanting what, my family took care of me. So I don't want to have this kind of horror story as well. But that is like, some of that is what we're talking about, right? And I think what you're saying is a good segue for us to talk about really our topic today. We're talking about repairing the disparities of the American church planting, right? The disparity, and if we're going to talk about repairing the disparities in American church planting, we got to be able to kind of jump in. And that's really where the bulk of what we're going to be talking about, right? And I understand from your work specifically with Sin Institute, that there are some disparities that you're seeing specifically among American church planting, and you got the facts, you got the data. This is not just something that we just kind of come and just give anecdotal stuff, but historically we have struggled, especially as African-American people, as Hispanic, Asian, right? And so as we talk about the need for minority-led networks, we also need to understand and talk about some of the disparities and how do we repair some of these disparities, specifically in church planting.
Yeah, I'm going to come at it from a couple of different angles here, and part of it is because not everybody has had the same experience, and not everybody has experienced the disparities in the same way. So, I mean, a case in point. So, as a setup to our conversation here, the language of multi-ethnic churches is a variation of, back in the 60s and 70s, a phrase that was used, which made sense back then because it was a black-white binary conversation around integrated churches. So when we say multi-ethnic churches today, what we're saying is, and it's primarily a term that emerged in the 90s, early 2000s, and it became, kind of, by the time I was planting a church, it became a pretty normal term. In the American conversation, in the Canadian conversation, it was not as like a pervasive thing. I planted churches in Toronto. And but if you trace back the language of that, it's important for us to understand that because we're going to get to disparities in. The evolution of multi-ethnic churches was a way in which white churches began to widen the conversation from the integrated churches conversation. So the black, can blacks and whites go to the same churches, which was very much the conversation during segregation, in the 60s and before, Jim Crow, officially on paper ended in '64, I believe. And but there's a continuation, right? And so, like that terminology is a reminder that there is a time when we actually use the term integrated churches, and people are still alive from that era. Like people still remember when churches were segregated. Right? Dr. King, he famously said that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. He said that multiple times. And what's ironic and what's interesting was that he also said that very same thing in 1961 when he preached at Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. And so he made that statement again in Southern, and this is an institution that would be meaningful to you and I because of our connections with the Southern Baptists. But he was invited in to speak at Southern in 1961, and he made that statement. And because Southern was one of the few Southern Baptist institutions that they were trying to figure out integration. They didn't do it well, but they were trying to figure it out. And but our language today is an indicator that we're not very far from the issues that churches were wrestling with in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so, and a big part of that was because of things like redlining. So I'm in Chicago. Chicago, in a lot of ways, is the almost like a prototype city for a lot of other cities, how they were eventually urbanized. And redlining was a huge part, right? So they would actually, have different policies for buying houses and those kinds of things. And so that actually drove where churches were started, where where African American churches would be located, where they wouldn't be located because of where the communities, where you could buy a home. And as much as people think that like we've made headways, housing is a big part. There's so much. Housing is a big part of this conversation. I mean, you live in the Old Fourth Ward, where there's still Section 8 housing, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Housing is a big part of this conversation. And so, ironically, maybe not ironically, but today is harder for a lot of African Americans to get loans to buy homes than it was even back then. So, I mean, that disparity has even increased, but that's a bit of a divergence. But housing drives where people live, and where people live drives where people plant churches. You see where I'm making the connection there. And so, and if we don't recognize this and we don't see the root problems of this and we don't name it, then we'll never get to some of these root disparities, because we think Jim Crow is over, but those things continue to persist because of the tracks that Jim Crow created, and people continue to live on those tracks. Even if by the word of the law has been abolished, the spirit of law is still there. So that's kind of that's an example from the African American community, and you have so much more experience in that. But we did at the Senate Institute, we did a research project a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, around Latino American church planting. And Bruce, you can drop it in the notes there for our folks at the Exponential Hub there. But our basic finding, Dhati, around this, we surveyed over, I think, 200, close to 300 Latino American church planters. And our basic finding was this, that Latino American church planters do more in terms of evangelistic church planting than with less funding. They receive less institutional funding and are expected to plant, they actually plant more evangelistic churches than the mainstream majority culture of church planting. And so, is this a disparity? I mean, I don't know. Like I'm not going to say that like this is a something written in policy. I wouldn't say that. But I think this is a peculiar finding that our institutions are willing to fund less, Latino American church planting. And this is not the same for all organizations. This is an aggregate, so different organizations are better at certain things. But I think it's telling that, again, we have this level of like disparity in different racialized groups. And I could probably go on. There's a couple of other things that we need to acknowledge when it comes to this conversation and how different people experience things differently. Because when we talk about training, for instance, and we talk about like resources, by and large, and you and I, have been a part of many of these conversations in trying to make it a better experience. But by and large, a lot of the training, a lot of the resources are developed for suburban, middle class, predominantly white church planting, models. And then we try to massage it and make it work for immigrant church planters, urban church planters, and there's nothing necessarily malignant about, like, nobody's trying to be mean or trying, but that's just the way it happens. That's the way it's set up. And so and then you got to ask the question, like, because what's happening is you build a table and then you integrate other folks into it, and so that continues to be a disparity, and that's part of the reason why it's important for us to reimagine what do minority-led networks look like, and how do we come behind there. There's a lot more, but I mean, I'll stop there.
No, I think that's really good. And that's what I love, because a lot of your information that you're talking about is from research. It's things that you have looked, it's been interviewing and getting real data and information and the historical data and what we're doing. And I think that that's really important for us as we kind of continue to navigate this conversation, and even in the future, as we're bringing in more and more leaders to kind of hear their stories, because their stories also make it look at it from a different angle. But part of this is the stories that we have that impacts and allows us to look at things in a different way. So when we talk about, like, as you mentioned, from 50 years ago, things like Jim Crow, and those kind of conjure up things like separate but equal, and all of that. And what we've seen is that in Christian circles, we have tried to navigate these realities, but not even just us navigate, we have led out in these realities and trying to manifest these. And sometimes I think we study them as if we're kind of bystanders, but we've impacted and we've even shaped some of these things, and so we got to look at not just what slavery does, but the effects of slavery, not just what the Industrial Revolution did to creating these disparities, but the effect of it, of these things. And, and like, even when we're seeing the rise or the evolution of the lack of men, we didn't just arrive here. It was because in the Industrial Revolution, in some of the things, the post-revolution, like all those things that took place that we see that have come. And then when we get the separate but equal, we see models like Campus Crusade for Christ or just InterVarsity, or any different people that in the past have tried to attempt to address like these things. And so we've created like separate but equal type models where my first ministries was Impact, which was a African-American branch of Campus Crusade for Christ. And so we kind of had this multicultural, multi-ethnic, separate but equal. Jim, in a sense, is like how do we address the issues and how do we reach and become evangelistic, but never getting at kind of the effects of it, of these things. And so I think it's really important for us, especially as we think about kind of Jim Crow, because what happened with Jim Crow is that, not only with our abolition of it, there was also impacts of that, because now if I was a doctor, at one point doctors and the drug addicts and all that, we were forced to live in the same neighborhoods, right? Because of Jim Crow. But now it also not only wasn't a racial issue, but it was also a socioeconomic issue, because what happened was as soon as doctors no longer had to live in a certain area, they could now move with other doctors. And what it did, it left our inner cities, it left our cities void and desolate oftentimes of spaces. And I think this is kind of what you see happening in these worlds, is that we see kind of the separation, between the have and the have-nots. And because the have and the have-nots understand, it's kind of like we create a scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of culture, and, kind of a transactional culture. And what ends up happening is that, and Jesus kind of speaks on this, but in that, the inner city, how is the inner city going to give back to us, right?
Yeah.
How, and so I'm not going to plant churches. I'm not going to create resources because it costs a lot of money to create these resources. And unless you have just kind of this heart, to pour in, this philanthropist heart to pour in and not necessarily return, but just simply the glory of God, just being manifested,
Yeah.
it doesn't make sense, right? To pour a lot of resources into these areas. And so this is what we've seen. But it's not until people who are raised and develop that heart. And this is the reason why you see the church at Antioch. The church at Antioch, there was these people. It's like, no, it's not just like a good idea to reach the city or these neighborhoods or these nations. Like, these are my people, right? And I tell people all the time, like, I don't live in the city or like because it's like I'm a missionary. I live in the city because I prefer to live in the city. I would rather live in the city than live in the suburbs or rural area, right? That's my preference. And we got to raise up people. And I think this idea of minority-led networks is kind of like, it's not just like, the tertiary energy of our organization, but we got to give our primary energy to reaching our best resources, freeing our best people up, people who were raised and have a passion and desire for this. And I think that is what is going to see kind of fruitfulness to taking that. And, and I think minorities are good. And this is why I've given through my boulevard, through all of these things, to helping to teach leaders to navigate this cultural divide, right? The whether it's indigenous, non-indigenous, like all of those types of people, we all need help in doing that. And I think that this is why I'm excited about this podcast, this series, what we're doing. I'm excited about helping us specifically in the area of church planning. And I know now I'm rambling, now I'm going, but really you get me wound up. And I just want to go. So,
but this is what you do, though. I mean, and a part of this is, I want to ask you, because you're in the process of starting My Boulevard, and a big part of is that we're going to come back to that in just a second here. But I think a big part of it is to really understand that so much of what you're saying, Dhati, is not rooted in organizational theory. It's rooted in your local church ministry experience, and it's embedded in who you are. I'll use the social scientist words, like it's your social location in which you minister is going to define the kind of organization that you're getting ready to launch and to lead. And that's true of many denominations and church planting networks. The social location of denominations, especially in the 50s and 60s, that was completely driven by segregation, the organizational structures have been developed out of that social location. The church planting networks that were developed in the 80s and the 90s from the Gen Xers, from a church growth mindset, not Don McGavran's version that he developed in the 70s that was based out of a church in India, but the church growth mindset, church growth movement that was developed by the suburban practitioners that were building churches in sprawling suburban communities around affluent communities. Like, those Gen X networks were driven by their social location. Yeah. And so what you're saying and what I'm saying is that let's acknowledge those social locations. Let's acknowledge that the structure is built around those organizations that were developed by those leaders, which I honor those leaders, and they were pioneers, and but we have to also understand that, like, those things become Saul's armor when you want to push those things down on minority leaders, and then also minority networks or families of churches. And I think so much of what you've said there is a constant reminder that if we don't allow these, to use that word, indigenous leaders and indigenous movements to develop in their natural environments, yours being in the 4th Ward of Atlanta, then you're always going to be constantly putting Saul's armor onto these folks. And man, we just hear that conversation all the time. And so whenever a network is thinking that they're doing something innovative, but then they want to integrate now the Black voice and the Asian voice and Latino voice or whatever, the rural voice. I mean, let's just not make it about race here, or the woman voice. Then it becomes you're just invited to put like some decorations on this tree that somebody else already put up. I'm trying to connect this to Christmas.
Yeah, no. I love what you're saying, and I think and I love how you're trying to connect it to Christmas. But you use sociological terms. I'm going to use kind of the terms I use because I think we are saying this same exact thing. A problem is not a real problem unless it's your problem, right? And something is not your problem. Something becomes your problem for two reasons. One is through relationship, and the other is proximity, right? And I think that's what we're saying is that proximity. Like I lived across the street from a park in the last 20, in the last 10 years with 20 murders, like on this park. And I just remember, like, this is not like a good idea. No, this is a real problem for me because my kids play across the street at this park. Right. Yeah. And so, like, there's a different level of desire and energy and prayer and all that goes into when something is a real problem. And that's a real problem because it's proximity. That's a real problem. But the other thing is that a problem becomes a real problem because of proximity, but the other one is relationship. Like, if my wife has a problem with something, even if it doesn't bother me as much as it bothers everyone else, it has become a real problem because it bothered someone that I love. And I think our problem with a lot of these networks and where we don't have real relationships and with people who don't look like us, talk like us, act like us, right? And so it's not a real problem. It's a good idea. We kind of know about it, but it's not heartfelt. It's not a necessity. It's not like for me, it feels like it's a moral imperative that if I don't do this, right? If I don't do this, like, I feel like I will be out of God's will, right? And I think that that's the type of people that we have to raise up. That is like, this is not just a good idea. This is something that we got to, it has to bleed out of us, right? And that was one of the reasons why I loved my position at the Sin Network. But I was just like, man, I can continue to maintain a position, or I can focus on the mission. And it just really felt like that kind of thing that was palpitating out of my chest was like, I got to get to it, and I got to spend all of my time to it. And I think that's what we got to get more of. This is not about a strategy per se. This is more about like a conviction, a calling, that as we get these different minority leaders and kind of share our stories about why this is needed, for us, in this time. I mean, what do you think? Right, that there's not enough kind of plant churches, denominational networks that are focusing in this area. I mean, what have you seen of the reasons, kind of why, and why do you think we need this to do this series?
Yeah. So I'm gonna throw a word out there, Dhati, and I want to brace everybody who's listening for this word, because this is. When we came up with the show title, we said we were going to talk about repairing disparities, but then I'm going to throw out the political and economic word reparations out there.
Daniel, see, people stop listening. Y'all don't leave us, please.
They checked out.
Yes,
and I'll say this: like in mentioning this word, it's kind of like CRT, and it's kind of like woke, and it's like I want to disarm like some of the power that's been given to this word, I think there's a basic foundational principle in reparations that we can't ignore, and it's very theological too. I won't unpack that, but if you all are interested, in Bruce, you can drop this in the hub there. But Duke Kwan, Greg Thompson, they wrote a book giving a biblical rationale for reparations, both within the church, mind you, and then also as an American institution. What does that look like? And I'll say this before I unpack that a little bit more, that in some mainline traditions, and when I say mainline, don't always think liberal, because not all mainline traditions are liberal. So case in point, like, there's the Lutheran Missouri Church, the Lutheran Church of Missouri Synod. I mean, they're still considered mainline, but they're very conservative. There's been traditions that have acknowledged, their complicitness in things like slavery and segregation, that they continue to work towards repairing within their own denomination, but also they work towards repairing these things in the neighborhoods that their churches are in, okay? And so I want to use the word reparations because, number one, it is provocative And the questions that people, bring up are, well, why would we want to contribute towards reparations if those who committed the wrongs, were from 100 to 300 years ago, so that's kind of the first objection. Second objection typically is, well, reparations isn't practical, because when do you stop reparations? And number three, kind of the other pragmatic rejection of reparations, specifically even in specifically to the church, is that once things are forgiven, that's water under the bridge. Like, why bring it back up? And the reason why I want to bring this term up, and I think it's important for our conversation, is real reparations, understood even the way that it's laid out in the Bible. So, for instance, again, I don't want to unpack this. Duke Kwan, Greg Thompson, they do a decent job, and you don't have to agree with everything they say. But there's the principle of reparations all throughout the Old Testament. You think about, Zacchaeus and what, Jesus asked him to do when he decides to become a follower. He decides to give back, all of the money that he had taken. And so, you see these themes. And I think it's important for us to not just fast forward to the actual pragmatic policies, but it's so important for us as organizational network leaders to really ask the question, okay, where in our organization has there been a structure that's emerged, that's been built out of a particular, brokenness in our history, tradition, and even in our strategies? So is there anything in our organization that we've built on, that we've developed, that's, maybe, a strategic thing, even embedded into our missiology? Is there anything about that if we look back on it, we can trace it back to something that historically did harm and damaged people? And then we have to honestly ask, have we properly dealt with that? And have we not just properly dealt with it? Let's start step one. Have we properly made the connections and made the acknowledgement that we have a system that has benefited from, a particular harm? I think that's a worthwhile question. And I don't think that's a very difficult question to ask. If you identify some of those things, or if you say, by proximity or even through relationship or through tradition, we have had some of those things. And I can give you examples, and Duke Kwan and Greg Thompson, they provide examples in their book of actual churches and organizations, Christian organizations, that say, how do we pivot? How do we repent as an organization? And how do we undo those things? How do we acknowledge, and how do we, own up to those things? And I think that's a very important part of it, because part of reparations isn't about paying money to people. Part of reparations is actually acknowledging the historic truths. It goes back to what you were saying earlier, Dhati, that those things still exist, and we can't ignore the after effects. And so that's a huge part. And there's a lot of resistance there. That's why you can't get to programs and policies, because people won't acknowledge the ongoing after effects of the things that were done that were harmful, 50, 100 years ago. And so, but if we can get to that point where you can acknowledge it and you say, hey, let's begin asking, how do we repair? Then you can talk about some of the more principled things of, okay, so how do we actually now begin to reinvest our strategies and our resources in a way that no longer creates harm? So case in point, let me say this. When we talk about church planting models, I am not against launch large. I'm not against house churches. I'm not against, but if the bottom line is always, how do we plant financially sustainable churches that are sustainable in year 3, 4, and 5, which I think is a worthy goal. But if that becomes the blanket goal for all of our church planting, by the very nature of that, you make this point that you made earlier, urban churches will almost always fail according to that metric, because you have different dynamics, in kind of more urban areas, specifically the more disadvantaged areas, you're going to have folks who can't give as much. You have folks who can't buy buildings. You have folks who, they can barely pay their rent. But you're also going to have gentrification coming in. So gentrification is driving up, the cost of doing business, the cost of doing organizations and churches in a particular city. And so if your strategy is by and large on average, every church has to be sustainable by 3, 4, 5. Just by sheer definition, the numbers of churches that are in those areas, you're always going to have, those churches are never going to be the center of like your network. They just never will be. There'll be an add-on, there'll be like this, department, there'll be this like stream, but they're not going to be like the center. And so if we don't get to the actual pragmatics of like what does reparations look like, which for some people, and this is my third point and then I'm done. When we think about repairing disparities, this is not an initiative. This is not a one-time payment. This is not a strategy. Repairing disparities is an ongoing posture. How long do we have to do this? For as long as it takes. How long do we have to do this? Until Jesus comes, until he comes to restore. Like, there's a sense in which like we continue to repair until like we really work towards a kingdom ideal. It's not a 5-year initiative. It's not a 10-year initiative. There may be some initiatives that you may define within a scope of time. But in terms of like that actual repairing disposition, it's a posture. Like we're going to do this for a long time. We're going to figure out how to plant churches, meaningful indigenous churches in areas that may never benefit us as a network. Like we may never get the payback system from these churches. And we got to be okay with that. And we may be given twice as much to those churches than we are to suburban churches. But by disposition, we're going to be okay with that. And this is where I hear the networks that are most okay with that. The networks that are most okay with that are those that are smaller networks, that they're kind of just like, they're invested for the long haul. We don't expect a whole lot in terms of payment. And that's why I think, minority-led networks are part of repairing some of these disparities. But I want to get back to what you're doing, Dhati, because I think this is, you said this is a calling for you. And in starting My Boulevard, like I like to hear from you, what are the disparities that you hope to address? And then secondly, while you're getting this off the ground, what are some of the unique challenges that you're facing?
Yeah, and thank you for sharing your heart. Honestly, Daniel, I don't really even know where I'm at on the reparations conversation. Thank you for the resource that you offered us. Here I just looked up the book. I'm definitely going to go look at it and read it and connect to it. But I do know that, right, we're awakening to the disparities, right? And people are seeing disparities. We're seeing the things. And I think that as believers in Jesus Christ, it is our responsibility to repair, right? So regardless of if you believe in the word reparations or not, and, I know there's a loaded word. I know that even saying that like causes certain things to certain people, and people, because they all got a different connotation to what that word means and all of that. I just think that but the word to repair brokenness that's clear. That's clear, biblical, clearly everything, and doing whatever we can. And the Bible says that if you have it in your need, if you have it in your means, but you say be warm and be filled and don't do anything, then that's not actually repairing, right? And so meeting the needs of the people. And so when we talk about that, I think it's really important. But specifically to answer your question for me, my boulevard, and really the reason why I planted Blueprint Church and all of that, was when I see the disparity is minority leaders, minority thinkers, people ministering in a majority minority context. What ends up happening is that we get a part of larger organizations, and we spend most of our time trying to help figure out how to integrate. And what ends up happening is the disparity is that we spend less and less of our time spending to helping on the real needs of our community, right? And I think that that's a huge disparity of thought leadership. And this is the reason why when you talk about ministering in an urban context or ministering in whether in minority, majority, multi-ethnic spaces, there's not as many books out. There's not as many resources out. One, because a lot of people are not buying the books. So then, and then so the publishers are not ready to do it, to use it. So there's lack of resources, there's lack of things. And so really what I want to see take place, and what I'm really even looking forward to, is how minority leaders are turning our attention and our focus to giving my primary energy. And again, that was the reason why, right? Because I could have spent some of my time on this while I'm leading all of it, but I wanted to focus on the mission that God has burdened for me, not at the expense or at the detriment of anybody else. I'm not trying to tear down anybody's table. I don't want to tear down anybody's table. I want to, it's like, we need more tables. We need more. And some of those tables are connected, interconnected. Some of those tables are separate. All of those things. We need as many tables as long as the gospel of Christ is being proclaimed. And I think that is really what's critical for us, and so for me, as I see that disparity, I want to help both my white brothers and sisters, my black brothers and sisters, my brown, like, I want to see all people of color. I want to be able to help those leaders to navigate, right, the cultural divide right now, because the Bible is true. And it says that they will know because of your love for one another. That love for one another has to aim at the greatest sin that we have, the sin of both the love of money and the sin of race in America. And if we're not addressing these two that are connected, and that is navigating the story, and if as Christians, if we're not repairing those things, right? Well, regardless of if we're not repairing that brokenness that we are facing in America, we're not addressing the real issues, and we got to run to the tension, of these things. And so part of that is like, I want to empower and encourage some people who are ministering in these contexts to spend their primary energy in addressing the real needs of our community, freeing them up and empowering them to do that. But I also want to help my white brothers and sisters, in order to help them, teach them to navigate the cultural divide, right? How do we do that? And I want to help leaders on both sides to be able to be able to do that. And so let me ask you a question, Daniel, sure. Right? So talk to me like someone who has authority to repair, right? To repair some of these disparities that we have. I'm talking about decision makers. I'm talking about influencers. I'm talking about people that want to invest, right? Where do they begin? And how do minority-led networks, how are they a part of the solution to some of these disparities that we've been talking about?
Yeah, this is really where, like, cultural and organizational change is going to happen. Is if both the network leaders, I'm just going to use that language, the network leaders, however you're structured as a denomination or as a network, and then those who are experiencing disparity, and I'm just going to shrink the categories to church planting. It's too complicated if we make it about America and all that stuff. But in the conversation of church planting in America, like that, there should be little to no gap between who the bottom line customer is, and that's probably going to be the church planter and the actual community that they're trying to reach, and the leader of that network. There should be almost very little distance. And that's very hard practically, because again, a lot of the existing networks right now are socially located in some suburb somewhere, because it was started in the 80s and 90s out of the church growth movement. And so, again, I hope y'all hear me saying this, and we're not knocking that. We're not knocking that. We're saying that was one stream. But if you're in that stream, now there are others that aren't in that stream. There are others, and I didn't grow up in that stream, but there are others who aren't in that stream. But if you are in that stream, that location from where you're at, that needs to grow. That distance needs to grow shorter between the people experiencing disparity. Because if it doesn't, this goes back to the point that you were making earlier. You're not owning the issue, right, Dottie? You said that if I don't see that hurt as my hurt, then I'm never going to feel the urgency to really repair that. Let me give you a good story of how I've seen this kind of make its way into organizational leadership. And a big part of this is a tie into Exponential, and I want to encourage Exponential to move forward in this direction and to not let go. But Dave Ferguson, who's the president of Exponential and also a local leader here in Chicago, And one of his small group members, who I believe is a Korean American, actually brings up to Dave this idea that, a lot of the reasons why African Americans can't get home loans these days is because banks won't loan to them, commercial banks won't loan to them. And there aren't enough African American owned banks that have enough capital to actually, it's because they're more likely to loan to African Americans. And so Dave and Quentin Murphy, who is also a leader here on the South Side, leading a church in South Side of Chicago, they came together and they came up with this idea that we're going to create something called Justice Deposits. And so Justice Deposits is an initiative that's encouraging churches to take their monies and to put it not in commercial banks, but to put it in Black-owned banks, because Black-owned banks are going to have a higher focus on giving good loans, fair loans to African Americans, right? So that's a great example of somebody like Dave Ferguson, and I use him as an example because you all are familiar with him at Exponential and at Sen Institute and the different various platforms here. But I use that as a very practical example that he worked to decrease the gap between. Part of it is because he was helping other local African American church planters like really work through what are the basic issues in your community. Not just I want to get you sustainable in terms of a church plant, but I want to help you really make a difference in your local community. And that is a great example of like something practical that Dave did and that he invited other people to do. But shrinking that distance is really, really an important part. And then secondly, I want to throw out there, this is a book. It's an older book. And it was actually, you're gonna love this, Dhati. It was written by a guy named W.T. Moore, who was a part of the Home Mission Board. So the Home Mission Board was the mission board that preceded the North American Mission Board, which Dhati and I both served out of. And so this book is called His Heart is Black. It's not a perfect book. It is by far not a perfect book at all. But it's a story of how over the last 60 years, so it was written in 1978 by W.T. Moore, but it tracked the progress and sometimes setbacks of the Home Mission Board of the Southern Baptists, of how they attempted to try to become more integrative in allowing African Americans to have more of a voice in their Home Mission Board. And so the title is called His Heart is Black. I mean, in 2021, it may feel kind of condescending and a misappropriation of that term. But what W.T. Moore was trying to say was that here were some white people within the denomination that were really trying to make change in the Southern Baptists, which I would argue may be one of the most difficult organizations to really implement some of these principles that I'm talking about when it comes to repairing. And so if you read through that book, you'll hear like some really difficult stories of how folks didn't make it. Like they're like, this is not going to work. We're going to leave. We're going to do our own thing. And then a lot of people did. A lot of people decided to leave and they did their own thing. And you're going to hear how some people stayed, both Black and then also white, and how over time there were different variations and iterations of helping to implement change within this mission structure. I would say it has become the predecessor to a lot of the things that Dhati, you and I have been able to do. And still don't feel like you've arrived, but there have been a litany of people that have been continuously hosting this conversation, pushing the boundaries of the conversation so that the solutions get better. And I think that that's absolutely necessary. If you're an influencer, don't be afraid to push the boundaries of the conversation. Expect the pushback. You're always going to make a mistake, but if you don't do that, then you're actually not creating enough space so that people can implement. If you expect the conversation to stay the same, people will only always implement within the boundaries that you create. You got to push the conversation so that there's more room for people to create. So those are some of my thoughts.
That's great. I love it. And one of the things as you were sharing, I was just like, man, like you're always dropping these great books for us to go. That's going to challenge our thinking and all that. But then I was just like, man, all right. One of my takeaways was, if you want to sound really, really intelligent, if you're writing a book, like you got to start off with initials first and then your last name. You got to start. So I'm like, I'm no longer going to be the Dhati Lewis. I'm going to be DB Lewis. DB Lewis. It's written by DB Lewis. Think about it, like Advocates, written by DB Lewis.
Dude, that's like a bestseller. I mean, you got C.S. Lewis, now you got DB Lewis.
DB Lewis. You see what I'm saying? It's just like, That's
And you just
that is it.
and you still got you gotta use your doctor title a little bit more, man. Don't be shy to use it.
I do. I gotta throw that out there, right? So Dr.
Angie
D.B.
worked
Lewis.
really hard for it, so
That
you
is,
gotta
yes, she
use it.
really did. She really did, and we gotta celebrate that. No, and I think that that's what you're saying is critical, and that's the reason why what we're talking about, right? There are many people throughout history, right? If we talk about the history of the states, history of denominations, network, church planting, all of those things, there's those who have stayed and those who have left, right? And so you talk about the people that have left that were not able to make it, in a lot of ways, and then whether they started their new things or not, like those, like I think we got to understand the impact, the effects of those things. Like, is it just happening? Is it just happenstance of, right? We know people come and go from companies and organizations all the time, but is there something unique about this, especially, and it's worthy of our attention because America was built on this stuff, right?
Yeah.
It was built on this stuff. So it's not like we're just trying to add, fuel to the flame, or we're just trying to spotlight, try to make a mountain out of a molehill. But no, we're saying like we know the history of slavery, the history of race relationships, right? And this is why oftentimes that I've said in the book that, in the book Advocates that I wrote, are in the series Undivided that I talk about it, that if we're going to make disciples in North America, we have to address the issue of race. And so I would expand this, say that if we're going to plant churches, seriously, plant churches for all people, plant churches everywhere for everyone, we got to address the issue of race. We got to address the disparities. And not only do we got to address the disparities, we have to come up with tangible and practical solutions to repair those disparities, right? We got to link up, right? It's not going to be one network, one denomination, one group that's going to be able to do it all. We got to build bridges. We got to do this thing together. And I think it's really important for us to understand those things, but we have to teach people how to navigate the cultural divide, because it's only getting worse out there. It's not getting better. You would think after, hundreds of years of kind of dealing with this, that we would be progressively getting better. But we're not, right? We're talking about it different ways. We're addressing it different ways. We're still seeing, a lot of some of the same disparities that we've seen for many years. And so my prayer is that as we're reading these books and these that we are having, that we would be challenged to think, challenged to process, challenged to allow it to open up our eyes so that we can, right, see kind of in our areas, what are some of the gaps that we have, and those gaps that are baked into our policies, that are baked into kind of the way we do things, are just baked into the lack of proximity or the lack of relationships that we have. So it's not a real problem, right? It's not a real problem to us, because even now what we end up doing is that we'll hire other minorities, and we think that just hiring a minority is the solution, but that minority may be coming from the same place that you came from, right? So they have the same problems that you have, but we got to hire people who are baked into the culture of these neighborhoods, of these minority, majority, multi-ethnic neighborhoods that are baked in to these areas, so that these problems are real problems. Because remember, I said, like, when we're talking about repairing problems, repairing disparities, a problem is not a real problem unless it's your problem. Yeah. And something doesn't become your problem unless it's through relationships or proximity. We have to raise up people who are living, feeling, breathing these problems. And this is the reason why I'm excited about highlighting some different ways for these different network leaders to basically be able to address these leaders that have taken action in some of these things, things like what I'm doing with My Boulevard, things like Passion to Plant Network by Dr. Liz Rios, right? Ethnos Network by Yukon Chiu, like the Rise Fund, like these different things that we're talking about, right? That we're having here, the term, Creek Collective, so on and so forth. These are people that have given us who are committed to doing this, and they're going to come at it from different ways and uniquenesses. It's not one way that everybody is doing it. And I think it's really important for us to highlight the similarities, but also highlight the differences that of how we're addressing and attacking each one of these things, these areas.
Yeah, so good. I really I love that you rattled off some of those networks that we'll be having deep dive conversations with in our upcoming episodes. And really, for these first few episodes, what Dhati and I have been wanting to do is to really set the scene for the actual brass tacks conversations of how do we come alongside minority-led networks and practically help them to build in a way that is, consistent with the vision that God's given them, but also in a way where they are well-resourced, not over-resourced, not under-resourced, but well-resourced. And so really looking forward to having those conversations. And if you all have any input, again, Dhati and I we're passionate about these things, but of course we have gaps and blind spots. But if there are other things that you think are worthwhile for us to address in our future episodes, I'd love for you to drop us a line at send.institute@wheaton.edu, send.institute@wheaton.edu. We'd love to hear your comments as well. Thanks for being a part in the chats as well. So anything else, Dhati, before we wrap up here?
Well, first of all, I'm very, very appreciative to those who are listening, those who have chimed in. Like Daniel said, please give us your feedback, give us your thought, give us subjects that you want to talk about when we talk about minority-led networks. But I also just want to thank Exponential, right? The Exponential team for hosting this Current Faces and New Ventures. This is giving us a platform for a discussion that we need to have, and being able to give people some backstage passes to how these conversations are being had. I think it's really important. And so, again, I'm excited. I'll see you next month. Everybody who's listening, as Daniel and I continue, and as we continue the conversation, and as we begin to spotlight a few of these emerging networks that you guys need to know about and you guys need to partner with. So we're excited about it. Until next time, we appreciate it. Grace and peace.